What if there was one object you could hold in your hand that felt exactly true on the best day of your life and exactly true on the worst? Centuries before the Stoics ever wrote a word, there is an old story about a king named Thoranis who ruled the kingdom of Meridia and who could not survive his own life. Not because it was hard, because it was extreme. Every victory sent him soaring so high he became reckless. Every defeat dropped him so low he became useless. He needed something no army or treasury could give him. The answer took a decade to find, was tested 3 times, and in the end, fit on a single finger. This is the story of King Thoranis and the ring that saved him from himself. Thoranis ruled Meridia, a wealthy and powerful kingdom on the edge of the known map, and by every outward measure, he had reason to feel steady. He did not. When his armies won, he celebrated so hard he made promises he could not keep and enemies he did not need. When his armies lost, he collapsed so completely that his own council feared to bring him news at all, unsure which version of the king would receive it, the reckless one or the ruined one. He was not weak. Weak men are simply overcome. Thoranis was ungoverned. Every external event, a harvest, a rumor, a single letter from a distant province, walked straight into his chest and took the wheel from his hands. His court had learned to read the sky before they read the throne room. One evening, exhausted from swinging between a triumph and a disaster in the same single week, King Thoranis called his wisest advisors into the great hall and gave them an impossible task. "Bring me something," he said, "that will hold true no matter what happens to me. Something that will keep me steady when I have won everything, and steady when I have lost everything. I do not care what it costs. I do not care where you find it. If such a thing exists anywhere between here and the edge of the world, find it. If it does not exist, one of you had better invent it, because I cannot keep living like this, and neither can this kingdom." The hall went quiet. Advisors who had spent their careers offering confident answers found they had none. One by one, they bowed and left to search, each certain his own particular expertise would be the one that finally solved the king. The court healer arrived first, with a rare root said to calm even a grieving widow. Thoranis chewed it. It calmed him for an afternoon, and by evening the next piece of news arrived and the root had nothing left to give. The court priest came next, with a chant said to have steadied kings for 100 generations. Thoranis recited it faithfully for 11 days and lost his composure entirely on the 12th over a dispute about a border fence. A traveling merchant arrived with a violet gem from the Far East, said to hold the wearer's emotions in perfect balance. Thoranis wore it to a war council and threw a chair across the room within the hour. None of them survived contact with an actual crisis. A root cannot argue with a battlefield. A chant cannot outshout a betrayal. A gemstone, however rare, is still just a stone, and stones do not think. Weeks became months. The council grew quieter, and more afraid to return empty-handed, until most of them simply stopped trying. One advisor had not spoken since the task was given. His name was Kallias, the oldest counselor in the court, old enough that the younger nobles had quietly started making decisions around him, mistaking his silence for having nothing left to offer. While the others chased rare roots and foreign chants, Kallias sat with the question itself. He was not asking what object could calm a king. He was asking a narrower question. What kind of object could be true in 2 completely opposite moments without changing itself at all? A root is used up. A chant depends on the mood of the man reciting it. A gemstone is only ever as calm as the story someone tells about it. He needed something that did not perform calm, something that simply stated a fact and let the fact do the work, unmoved, whether the king was drowning in triumph or in grief. Not powerful. Small enough to carry into a war tent and a wedding feast alike, honest enough to say the same thing in both. After many quiet weeks, Kallias rose, walked to the palace workshop, and asked the jeweler for the plainest ring in the building. Not the finest, the plainest. The jeweler offered him gold rings studded with stones, each finer than the last. Kallias waved them off and pointed to a thin, unremarkable band at the back of the shelf, the kind given to soldiers, not kings. Inside the band, he had 4 words engraved, small enough that only the wearer would ever read them. He carried it to the throne room and placed it in the king's hand without ceremony. "Wear this always," Kallias said. "In your greatest victory, before you do anything you cannot undo, look inside the band and read it. In your darkest hour, before you let yourself believe it will never end, look inside the band and read it. It will not fix anything or make the grief lighter. It will simply be true, the same way, both times." That is the whole design. Thoranis turned the plain ring over, visibly unimpressed, next to the violet gem still sitting discarded on a side table. Some old habit of taking Kallias seriously even without understanding why, made him slide it onto his finger and read the inscription anyway. "This too shall pass," he frowned. It did not feel like much. He wore it anyway, mostly out of respect for the only advisor who had not wasted his time. Years passed before the ring was truly tested. Meridia's oldest rival was a neighboring kingdom ruled by King Voras, who had raided Thoranis' northern villages for a generation and never once answered for it. When Thoranis finally marched north, the campaign took 8 months and ended, against every prediction, in total victory. Voras surrendered his crown at the gates of his own capital. The celebration in Meridia lasted 3 days. In the Great Hall, drunk on the largest triumph of his reign, Thoranis stood to make promises to his assembled nobles, taxes forgiven, titles handed to men who had not earned them, a new war against a second kingdom he had no real quarrel with, simply because winning felt so intoxicating he wanted more of it immediately. In the middle of that speech, from old habit more than belief, his hand brushed the ring. He glanced down and read it, the way he had absent-mindedly 100 times before, without it meaning anything. "This too shall pass." The room did not stop celebrating, but something in Thoranis did, long enough to remember that this feeling, enormous as it was weather moving through him, not a permanent address. He finished his speech differently than he started it. Fewer promises, no new war. He let the actual victory be enough, instead of reaching for a second one to chase the feeling of the first. It was the first time the ring had changed anything. He noticed. In the years after Voras' surrender, the ring became something closer to a second heartbeat. Not just for wars and coronations, for the small, ordinary tempers of ruling a kingdom. A trade dispute that once would have ended in Thoranis banning the guild outright, now ended in a compromise because he read the ring and remembered the dispute would look small in a year. A quarrel with his own daughter over her choice of husband, the kind of argument that in his younger years would have echoed through the palace for a week, softened within a single evening, because he asked himself honestly whether he would still be angry by winter. He usually was not. He did not become a different man overnight. He still lost his temper. But he began catching himself a beat earlier each year, the way a habit strengthens with practice rather than willpower. Kallias, watching from the back of the court, aging visibly now, allowed himself to look satisfied. The second true test arrived without warning, the way the worst ones always do. Demir had been Thoranis' closest general for over 20 years, a childhood friend, the one man in the kingdom he trusted without reservation. When a border garrison was quietly sold to a hostile power and Meridian soldiers were ambushed and killed, it took weeks for the truth to surface. Demir had arranged it, for wealth and a promised throne of his own. There was no ring reading in the first hour. Thoranis raged in a way the court had not seen in a decade, upending tables, refusing food for 2 days. The old ungoverned king was fully back, and for a moment it looked as though years of practice had washed away the instant a wound was deep enough. On the third night, alone, unable to sleep, certain that nothing would ever be whole again, he looked down at his hand out of pure exhaustion rather than discipline. This too shall pass. It did not erase the betrayal or bring back the soldiers Demir's greed had gotten killed. It did not make Thoranis trust easily again, and it should not have. But it reminded him that the crushing weight of that night was not the final shape of the rest of his life. It was a night, and night's end. He got up the next day and dealt with Demir's betrayal as a ruler, rather than only a wounded friend, cleanly, without the extra cruelty his rage had wanted to inflict. Kallias later called it the ring's finest hour, not because it made the pain smaller, but because it kept the pain from making Thoranis smaller too. Most tellings of this story end with Demir's betrayal, because it is the most dramatic. But the version worth remembering has a third test, quieter than the other two, and in some ways, harder. Years later, an old man now, Thoranis woke to a stack of unremarkable complaints. A tax dispute, a leaking roof, a minor noble offended over seating at a dinner. Nothing that would be recorded in any history of his reign. The kind of day that wears a man down one small irritation at a time until he snaps at someone who did not deserve it. He caught himself, hand halfway to the ring out of habit now rather than crisis, and almost laughed. This too shall pass, applied just as cleanly to a leaking roof as it did to a war. Wars and betrayals announce themselves. A bad, grinding, ordinary day rarely does, which is exactly why most men never think to apply any philosophy to it at all. He handled the tax dispute fairly, ordered the roof repaired, and sat through the dinner with more patience than the complaint warranted. None of it was memorable. That, Thoranis later told Kallias, was the entire point. The ring was never built for the 2 or 3 enormous days in a life. It was built for the ordinary ones in between, which is where a life is actually lived. Kallias died an old man, in his own bed, having outlived most of the court that once mistook his silence for having nothing to say. Thoranis, gray-haired himself by then, sat with him in his final days and finally asked the question he had never quite asked. Why 4 words? Why not something wiser, something that actually explained how to live? Kallias, weak but still precise, said the other advisors had tried to hand him wisdom, and wisdom is heavy. It has to be studied and applied correctly, or it falls apart under pressure. He had tried to hand him a fact instead. Facts do not require belief. This too shall pass was never a philosophy. It was simply true the day it was engraved, true through every victory and betrayal and leaking roof since, and would go on being true long after both of them were gone. He had not given the king wisdom. He had given him something sturdier, something that never asked to be believed, only to be read. Thoranis wore the ring for the rest of his life and asked to be buried with it. Here is what the story is actually about, underneath the ring itself. Centuries after this story is said to have taken place, the Stoics built an entire philosophy around the same 4 words, without ever having heard of King Thoranis or his advisor. Marcus Aurelius wrote that all things are born to change, dissolve, and pass away, so that new things might exist in their place, and that a man who understands this stops being shocked by loss and stops being consumed by gain. Seneca called the deeper practice amor fati, meeting whatever fate brings without wasting energy wishing it were different. Epictetus, simpler still, taught that it is not events that disturb us but our judgments about them, and a king reading 4 engraved words mid-triumph or mid-betrayal was practicing exactly that. None of them meant that nothing matters, and neither did Kallias. They meant the opposite. Precisely because a moment will pass, you are free to act inside it wisely instead of being ruled by it. The ring did not make Thoranis feel less. It made him think one full beat before the feeling made his decisions for him. Over 3 tests and 100 ordinary days, that one beat was the entire difference between the reckless king who summoned his court in a panic and the man his own advisor chose to grow old beside. The ring never controlled the weather of a life. It just kept Thoranis from mistaking any single day good, bad, or simply ordinary for the whole forecast. You do not need a jeweler or a king's court, and you certainly do not need a war or a betrayal to make this true for you. You need the same 4 words, applied honestly, the next time you are either too high or too low, or simply too worn down by an ordinary Tuesday to think clearly. This too shall pass. If this story landed, subscribe, there are more of these coming. And if you want a daily version of the same discipline, something closer to what Kallias actually gave a king, not a feeling but a practice, Becoming Stoic is a free app built for exactly that. Until the next one.